Hi there, welcome back. My name is Sheldon McLeod. This is Thinking Out Loud, presented to you here exclusively on the Saltwire Network. And I've had, a lot of time to watch the news and see what's going on and to give you my thoughts on it. That's partly what this platform is about. And there's so much happening in the world right now. And, oftentimes news folks will go with the story that seems to be the biggest. And for a generation, my generation, the end of the Cold War in the 1980s was a huge deal. And so was the Soviet leader, the last Soviet leader, who just recently passed away at the age of 91. And I don't know if you remember, Mikhail Gorbachev was very much, became in some ways a pop culture icon. He was involved in commercials. And there's a few things I wanted to talk about with Bob Huish. And he is an associate professor in the Department of International Development Studies at Dalhousie University. And it's good to see you again, Bob.
Always a pleasure, Sheldon. Thanks so much.
So, Professor, I want to talk about world politics, but I want to start domestically first. And I want to play something, and the language is coarse. It'll be bleeped up, but it's still quite aggressive. This was an interaction that a citizen had with the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada. He was at a city hall. She happened to be there, and this is what transpired.
Great, that's Chrystia.
Chrystia!
Yes.
What the f*** are you doing in Alberta? You f***ing traitorous f***ing bitch! Get the f*** out of this province!
You don't belong here.
You're a f***ing traitor! You f***ing bitch!
Yeah, go ahead and hide.
All right, guys, you got a traitor in the f***ing elevator. Chrystia Freeland, I'm going. No. I'll walk up with my own power. Don't touch me, okay? Don't touch me.
All right. So you hadn't seen that video?
No, that's the first time I saw that, Sheldon. That's disturbing, to say the least.
And this is someone who has been known for promoting and talking about the freedoms, talking about the convoy, a man who's on the record online for doing so. And I spoke with a minister this week, Minister Carla Qualtrough, and she says she's had personal experiences like that where police had to be called. Is this a Canadian phenomenon?
No, not at all. This is a global phenomena that has come up in politics, and it's raised a very ugly head, like Greek mythology, like a hydra. It keeps coming up. You try to get rid of it and it comes back. And it's particularly targeted at women politicians, female politicians. This is happening in Canada. It's happened in the United Kingdom. It happens routinely in the United States. And you see it in other countries. Mr. Putin has got a long legacy of doing the very same thing. And what it is it's not any sort of freedom of expression. It is direct intimidation against female candidates. And it's not just rooted in confronting and harassing a group of women in an elevator, such as that individual did. It extends deep into our political systems, where women candidates face a whole litany of challenges to try to get into office in the first place. And once they're there, then there's this level of harassment that tends to follow them. Catherine McKenna is another example of a female politician who stepped away, and the harassment that she faced was extraordinary on Twitter, and even her own constituency office was vandalized. And it's again not something I would call a new age of democracy. It's a reversal. It's reverting to intimidation and bullying, and that's not the kind of system that we would expect in 2022.
I know you're with the Department of International Studies, but the paradox of tolerance is that, to have a tolerant society, at times you have to show intolerance towards certain behavior. But at that, isn't there a risk that it can fan the flames and gain more support and perhaps start to snowball once you see people who are, well, I'm just saying something, I'm not physically assaulting, and if, as the RCMP are investigating, they move to lay charges, what that might do to that whole movement.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is, with any sort of democratic institution, and with especially our elected officials, the reason that they're in power in the first place is to have openness and dialogue with them. So, dialogue is something that is a skill that needs to be appreciated. And by getting in someone's personal space and verbally berating them and harassing them and yelling over them and using profanity in that way, that's not in any sense a form of discussion, right? That's just picking a fight. And we don't encourage school-age children to do that, and to see voting age adults doing that too is a real it's a real gruesome thing. And I think it's something that has emerged quite strongly to the forefront in the last 6 years. We've really seen that since basically the end of the Obama administration, and when Hillary Clinton was running against Donald Trump. That seems to when it gained a lot of license, that people felt they could come out and harass politicians, harass women politicians especially, and in the process spread disinformation along the way, like to create these claims of that just don't make any sense, or they're not factual. So it's a challenging time for our democratic institutions, and also, as a professor to even teach about these topics, it's uphill.
Well, and later in that video, this individual says, "I'm the only one fighting for this country." There's that sense, and that's something else that's a bit. It's hard for people like you and I to try and understand how that type of behavior can be seen as something that's moving us forward in any way. Mm-hmm. It's about confrontation. I don't know if complacency and confrontation are two sides of the same coin. When it comes to politics. But I want to shift gears a little bit. I know I heard you speaking on the radio today about the passing of the last leader of the USSR, or the Soviet Union. And I remember being alive at that time when the wall came down and the end of that whole USSR as a movement. But I was a young man, not really paying that close attention. How significant was this man to that movement and to world events in the mid-'80s when there were so many conservative type leaders? Brian Mulroney in Canada, Ronald Reagan in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, and Gorbachev, who became a part of that group at the time.
Yeah, it was the 1980s could have gone in a very, very different direction if Mikhail Gorbachev was not the premier leader of the Soviet Union. And the part of that is that the Soviet Union was failing itself in many different areas. It was a regime that was built on mistrust and a lack of faith in people for many decades of it. And really, it came up to the Chernobyl explosion, the nuclear explosion in Chernobyl. And that's when Mikhail Gorbachev, again, he wasn't a revolutionary. He wasn't set out to try to destroy the Soviet Union. That wasn't his ambition at all. But seeing how Chernobyl was managed, and to see how the government tried to cover it up and said, no, there's no problem here. Well, no, it was dealt with through lies and mistrust, and it was brought to that situational catastrophe because of dysfunction. Mikhail Gorbachev started to reach out to the West even further, particularly Mr. Reagan, Mr. Mulroney, Ms. Thatcher, to say we need to try to find new ways of engaging the world and not just be this empire of Russia. Now, Mr. Putin would look at Mr. Gorbachev as being a failure, a traitor to the Soviet, to Russia today. So that's one thing. But what Mikhail Gorbachev believed in was ultimately human values. Is that he thought that individuals had value, and that the role of the state is to somehow ensure those values are respected. And he wasn't seeing it. He wasn't seeing it even as he was growing up. He was born in the southern part of Russia under Stalin, and they just collectivized all the farms. And he was a technocrat. He was a functionary of the system. But what he thought could happen was that you could have some form of social protection and democracy living side by side in what they called the perestroika, the restructuring of Russia. And then the glasnost was opening up to the world. But the world at the time, Mr. Reagan, Mr. Mulroney, Ms. Thatcher, they're all in the mindset, we're winning the Cold War. So even though there was those partnerships starting to emerge, it was seen as one side defeating the other. And it wasn't Mikhail Gorbachev's intention to see the whole thing fall apart, but his legacy was one where it projected Russia down this very open for business for some model in the 1990s, and then eventually giving rise to Mr. Putin today.
And obviously the Nobel Peace Prize, and in many ways, this was the start of the denuclearization, the end of that race to, as I believe there's a few comments from Ronald Reagan at the time saying, we have to start to reduce the number of weapons. There are just far too many weapons. And we're in a different place now. Obviously, Russia is in a different place. I showed that quote. There was a quote from Vladimir Putin who says, that Gorbachev deeply understood that reforms were necessary. Now, by all accounts, Vladimir Putin is in a different place right now in the world in the way the planet is viewing what's happening with the Russian leader. So how do we properly assess the role that, or the place in history that Gorbachev should reside in 2022, given what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, Mikhail Gorbachev is, I think, going to be seen outside of Russia as the person who brought some calming to the Cold War, and one who also broke away from a lot of the habits that the Soviet Union were trying to reinforce. So that's in two different directions. And the first is that you had a lot of student movements, not necessarily in Russia, but in behind the Iron Curtain, right? What is now Czech Republic, then Czechoslovakia, student movements there, East Berlin as well. There were calls for more freedoms and democracy coming out of, well, the countries in Europe, sort of east of the Danube. And Mikhail Gorbachev realized we're not gonna throw tanks at them. We're not gonna repress crowds like his predecessors did. Instead, he went and engaged them. And I think that story will come out stronger in the West, because really the memory, like you said, if you live through those days, you'll remember like the Pizza Hut commercial with Mikhail Gorbachev, or the puppets as you showed there. He's sort of this curious character, but really he could have gone the other way, which would have been heavy hammer, and the infrastructure in the Soviet Union was designed for that. So that's the one era. And then the other, in terms of the denuclearization, it's something that kind of started before he showed up. In the 1970s, we can safely say the U.S. superseded Soviet Union with nuclear power. The big issue is that most of the nuclear arsenal in the USA went to sea, went into submarines, or it went on various vessels, and so it was harder to track. The Soviets, they had a bit of that, but most of it stayed fixed in missile sites, and that's called counterforce, countermeasure. And if you're always able to keep your side invisible, well, the other side doesn't know what to do. They can't really target you. Right. So they had the superior hand, and they knew it. And I think that's why Mr. Reagan and others, conservative politicians at the time, were welcoming Mikhail Gorbachev over, but they really didn't want to give many concessions back, because they knew that the system inside was falling apart. And I remember just how many jokes Reagan would make. It was famous for this, about getting up at a Toastmaster speech and just sort of cracking jokes about Soviet politics all the time. And there were Soviet diplomats in there kind of laughing along like, yeah, that's funny. Not really.
Not really. Funny, not funny. He's the acting graduate coordinator and associate professor of the Department of International Development Studies in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Dalhousie University. Dr. Robert Huish, thank you again. Always great to chat.
Great to talk, Sheldon. Thanks so much.